The first thing I heard wasn't a voice. It was metal, hollow, sharp, echoing across gravel like someone staking a claim where they didn't belong. And when I stepped out into the cool 5:30 a.m. air, the smell of fresh asphalt still hanging low and bitter in my throat, I saw it. Bright white, bolted deep into the ground at the entrance of my road like it had always been there. HOA private access only. I just stood there for a second, boots crunching slow against the gravel I paid for, built with my own hands. Every inch of that quarter-mile stretch carved out of raw Texas dirt, with a rented grader, and 200 hours of sweat under a summer sun that didn't care if you lived or died. And now some polished sign with clean edges and corporate lettering was telling me I needed permission to use it. Funny thing is, the air felt different that morning. Still, tight, like something had already gone too far. I ran my hand along the edge of the sign, felt the cold metal against my fingers, new bolts, fresh install, no rust, no weathering. Which meant they did this overnight, quiet, calculated, thinking nobody would notice until it was already normal. That's how they work. They don't kick the door down. They move the walls an inch at a time until you don't recognize your own house anymore. I looked down the road, my road, stretching clean and straight past the oak line toward my property, and halfway down I spotted a second sign, then a third, like breadcrumbs leading into a trap I didn't agree to. That's when I heard tires behind me, slow roll, deliberate. I turned and there she was, Victoria Hale, stepping out of her white Lexus like she owned the sunrise, sunglasses already on even though the sun hadn't cleared the horizon yet, clipboard tucked under her arm like a badge she gave herself. Community improvement, she said, voice smooth, rehearsed, like she'd practiced it in a mirror. This access now falls under HOA regulation. I remember the way the word now landed, like time itself had shifted without asking me. I didn't say anything at first. Didn't need to. Because what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that this road wasn't just private. It was protected, documented, locked into county records older than her entire development plan, written in language that doesn't bend just because someone prints a sign and calls it authority. But standing there, looking at those signs, hearing gravel crunch under her heels like she belonged there, I realized something else. This wasn't just about a road. This was about control. About turning something I built to stay free into something they could manage, tax, and police. And they thought they'd already won. I let my eyes move past her, back to the line of signs cutting through my land like a quiet invasion, and for a second, I almost smiled. Because if they were bold enough to do this in the dark, they were about to learn what happens when the truth shows up in broad daylight, with a badge, a camera, and the kind of law you can't rewrite with a clipboard. I built that road the long way, the kind of way that does not show up in a brochure or a developer pitch, the kind of way that starts with a handshake and ends with your hands bleeding through work gloves that cost more than you wanted to admit, because nothing about it was easy and nothing about it was supposed to be shared. My name is Ethan Cole, 38 years old, licensed contractor, second-generation builder, and everything I own sits at the end of that stretch of gravel and asphalt I carved out myself. My father used to say that land only respects you if you respect it first, and I remember standing beside him when I was 12 years old, watching him mark out a fence line with nothing but wooden stakes, a measuring tape, and a level of patience I did not understand back then. The smell of cut cedar and diesel fuel used to hang in the air for hours after we finished a job, and even now, standing on that same land, I can still feel the heat rising off the ground and hear the distant hum of machinery like it never really left. When I bought this property 6 years ago, it was nothing but raw acreage and a problem no one else wanted to solve, because the access point was a mess of uneven terrain and old county lines that scared off developers who preferred clean, easy parcels. But I saw something different. I saw a way in. So I pulled permits the right way, spent months in county offices that smelled like paper and stale coffee, filing documents, reviewing zoning maps, making sure every inch of that road was recorded, approved, and legally mine. No shortcuts, no assumptions, no handshake deals that could come back later and bite me. I hired crews when I needed them, but most of it I did myself, grading the land under a sun that did not let up, laying base material one load at a time, measuring slope and drainage because I knew if I got it wrong, the first heavy rain would wash it all away like it never existed. I remember the first time I drove down that finished stretch, tires rolling smooth instead of fighting loose gravel, and the quiet that followed, that kind of quiet that tells you something is finally right. That road was never meant to connect anything except me to my own land. It was not part of a subdivision, not tied to any association, not subject to anyone's idea of community standards. That was the whole point. Freedom does not come in bulk, and it definitely does not come with a monthly fee. So when I stood there that morning staring at those signs, hearing Victoria Hale talk about regulation like it was already decided, I was not just looking at a piece of metal stuck in the ground. I was looking at someone trying to rewrite 6 years of work, paperwork, and purpose with a single sentence. And the worst part was not the sign itself. It was the way she said it, calm, confident, like she believed the system would back her no matter what the truth actually said. That is when something settled in my chest, not anger, not yet, something colder, something clearer, the kind of understanding that comes when you realize this is not a misunderstanding. This is a move. And if I did not respond the right way, it would not stop at a sign. Victoria Hale did not raise her voice. She did not need to, because everything about her was designed to carry authority without effort. From the way her heels pressed into the gravel, like it owed her support, to the way her sunglasses stayed on even when she was speaking directly to me, like eye contact was something she reserved for equals, and she had already decided I was. Not one. She stepped closer to the sign, ran her fingers lightly across the edge like she was admiring a finished project, and that was when I noticed the details that told me more than her words ever could. The clean vinyl lettering, the standardized font used in most suburban developments, the small code printed in the corner that referenced HOA compliance guidelines. All of it manufactured to look official enough that most people would not question it. That was her real skill, not construction, not law, but presentation, making something look legitimate long enough that it became accepted as truth. I had heard about her before I ever saw her. The kind of reputation that travels quietly through contractors, surveyors, and county clerks who have to deal with people like her more often than they would like to admit. Victoria Hale, president of the Ridgeview Estates Homeowners Association, real estate broker, self-appointed guardian of property values, and according to more than one conversation I had overheard in waiting rooms and job sites, someone who believed rules were flexible as long as they bent in her direction. Her husband sat on the city council, not a high-ranking position, but just enough influence to make phone calls matter and paperwork move faster than it should. That combination, money, access, and confidence, created a kind of quiet immunity that let her operate one step beyond what most people would challenge. I watched as she gestured down the length of my road, explaining how it now served as a secondary access point for the community, how it improved traffic flow, how it aligned with long-term development plans that had apparently been discussed without me ever being part of the conversation. Her voice carried that same polished tone, like everything she said had already been approved somewhere higher up, even if that place did not actually exist. What stood out was not just what she said, but what she assumed, that I would hear her explanation, feel outnumbered, and step aside, because challenging something wrapped in official language feels heavier than it actually is. I let her finish, listened to every word, because sometimes the most important information is not in the documents. It is in the confidence of the person misusing them. Then I looked past her again, not at the signs this time, but at the edge where my property line met the subdivision boundary, the invisible line that separated what I built from what she controlled, and I realized she was counting on that line being blurred. That was the first real mistake she made, not putting up the signs, not claiming authority, but assuming I did not know exactly where that line was, down to the inch, down to the survey markers still buried just beneath the surface where she thought no one would check. And as she stood there, talking about community like it was something she could extend by declaration, I could already see the gap forming between what she believed and what was actually enforceable, a gap that does not stay hidden forever, especially when someone is willing to dig for it. By mid-morning, the air had warmed up enough to carry the smell of hot dust and fresh paint, and that was when the second wave hit, not loud, not dramatic, just steady, deliberate, like a plan unfolding exactly the way it was designed to. A pickup truck I had never seen before rolled up to the entrance, slowed down just enough for the driver to read the sign, and then kept going like it belonged there, tires pressing into the surface I had leveled myself, gravel shifting under weight that was never supposed to be there in the first place. 10 minutes later, another car. Then another. By noon, it was no longer a one-time mistake. It was traffic, light but constant, a quiet stream of people who saw a sign and trusted it more than the land beneath their wheels. I stood off to the side, arms crossed, listening to the rhythm change. The crunch of tires no longer spaced out in private, but overlapping, layered, like my road had been absorbed into something bigger without a single signature from me. Around 1 p.m., the first physical addition showed up. 2 workers in reflective vests unloading a metal post, and a small barrier arm from the back of a utility truck, moving with the kind of casual efficiency that comes from doing a job you assume has already been approved. I walked over, boots kicking up small clouds of dust, and asked who authorized the install. One of them checked his clipboard, pointed to a printed work order with Ridgeview Estates stamped across the top, and said they were just following instructions. That was the second time that word came up that day. Instructions, like responsibility, could be passed along until no one questioned where it started. I could hear voices behind me as a couple of residents from the subdivision gathered near the entrance, watching, curious but not concerned, because from their perspective, this was an improvement, a convenience, something that made their daily drive a little easier without costing them anything directly. One of them even nodded at me, like we were on the same side of it, like I should be grateful that my road was now part of something more organized. That was when Victoria came back, same car, same calm expression, stepping out like she was checking on progress instead of pushing a boundary. She glanced at the barrier being installed, then at the small group forming nearby, and I could see it in the way she carried herself. This was not just about access anymore. This was about normalization, about turning something questionable into something accepted by repeating it until it felt permanent. She explained, again, that the road now served the community, that the signage was necessary for clarity, that the barrier would help manage usage, all of it framed as reasonable, measured, almost helpful, like she was solving a problem I did not know I had. But standing there, listening to the metal clink of bolts tightening into place, feeling the ground under my boots that I had measured and graded myself, I realized the real shift had already happened. This was no longer a conversation. It was implementation. And every minute that passed, every car that drove through, every bolt that locked that barrier into position, made it harder for anyone else to see it the way I did, as something that had been taken, not given. That was the moment it stopped being a disagreement and became something else entirely, something that was not going to fix itself with a simple conversation or a polite objection, something that required more than standing there and watching it happen. By late afternoon, I decided to do it the simple way first, the way most reasonable people would expect things to be handled, face-to-face, direct, no escalation, just facts laid out clean and clear like they were meant to be understood. I walked back down to the entrance, the sun now high enough to bake the surface of the road until heat shimmered just above it, and the barrier arm cast a thin shadow across the ground like a line someone dared me to cross. Victoria was still there, talking with a couple of residents, her tone light, confident, like the entire situation had already settled into place. I waited until she finished, then stepped in, keeping my voice level, steady, the same way I would on any job site when something was off but still fixable. I told her the road was privately owned, fully permitted, recorded with the county, and not subject to any homeowners association jurisdiction. I explained the boundaries, the survey markers, the fact that there was no legal basis for what she had installed. She listened, or at least she stood there long enough to give the impression of listening, her expression barely changing, like she had already decided which parts of my words mattered and which ones did not. When I finished, she smiled, not dismissive exactly, but practiced, the kind of smile that comes from years of telling people no in a way that sounds polite. She said the association had reviewed the access situation and determined that the road functioned as a de facto extension of the community infrastructure, and therefore fell under their management guidelines. That phrase, de facto, hung in the air longer than anything else she said, because it was not law, it was interpretation, and she was using it like it carried the same weight as a signed document. I told her interpretation does not override ownership. She responded that community standards often required flexibility, especially when improvements benefited the majority. I could feel the conversation shifting, not toward resolution, but towards something more frustrating, where facts were being met with language designed to blur them. A few of the residents nearby nodded along with her, not because they understood the details, but because her version sounded organized, official, easier to accept than the idea that something had been done without proper authority. I pointed to the barrier, the signs, the increased traffic, and said all of it needed to be removed. She glanced at the setup, then back at me, and for the first time there was a slight edge in her tone, still controlled, but firmer, like she was drawing a line. She said the installation was approved through internal review and would remain in place pending any formal dispute. Formal dispute, meaning paperwork, time, process, the kind of slow system that favors whoever is already in motion. I realized then that she was not expecting me to win an argument. She was expecting me to get tired of having one. The wind picked up just enough to rattle the sign lightly, a hollow sound that carried across the entrance, and I looked at it again, then at the road behind it, then back at her, and understood something that made everything clearer. This was never meant to be resolved in a single conversation. This was meant to outlast me. The next morning started quieter, but it did not stay that way for long, because control does not need noise to spread, it just needs repetition, and by 7:15 a.m., I could already hear it happening, tires rolling in a steady pattern, doors closing, voices carrying faintly through the warm air as people used my road like it had always been part of their routine. The barrier arm was no longer just sitting there, it was active now, rising and lowering with a soft mechanical hum every time a vehicle approached, a small keypad mounted on the side where residents punched in codes that I never approved, never authorized, but somehow already existed. I stood off to the side again, watching the system run itself, and that was the part that bothered me more than anything, not the sign, not even the barrier, but the fact that it worked, clean, efficient, convincing enough that no one questioned it anymore. Around mid-morning, a delivery truck pulled up, slowed, then stopped when the driver hesitated at the keypad, unsure. Before I could step in, one of the residents walked over, entered a code, and waved him through like they were doing him a favor. That was how it spread, not through force, but through convenience, through people helping each other follow a rule that was never real to begin with. By noon, the wear pattern on the road had already started to shift, faint but noticeable if you knew what to look for, tire marks drifting wider, gravel pushed toward the edges where traffic was heavier than it was ever designed to be. I walked the length of it slowly, boots pressing into the surface, feeling the difference under each step, every small change adding up to something bigger, something that said this was no longer mine in the way it used to be. When I reached the midpoint, I stopped and looked back toward the entrance, the sign barely visible from that distance, but still there, still defining something it had no right to define. That was when I noticed another detail, something I had not seen the day before, a small placard mounted beneath the main sign with fine print referencing, authorized access enforcement, and a contact number tied to the homeowners association office. It was subtle, easy to miss, but it changed the entire tone, because now it was not just a suggestion, it was enforcement, implied authority layered on top of something already questionable. Later that afternoon, I found a notice tucked near the base of one of the posts, printed on thick paper, clean edges, official formatting, stating that unauthorized use of the road would be subject to penalties under community guidelines. Penalties on my property. I picked it up, felt the weight of the paper between my fingers, and read it twice just to make sure I was not missing something obvious. But it said exactly what it looked like, and that was when the frustration started to shift into something sharper. Not loud, not explosive, just focused. Because this was not just about access anymore. It was about them creating a system that looked legitimate enough to stand on its own, one that could operate whether I agreed with it or not. And the longer it stayed in place, the more it would become real in the eyes of everyone else. I folded the notice once, slipped it into my pocket, and looked down the road again, not as something that had been taken, but as something being rewritten in real time, one sign, one code, one assumption at a time, and I knew right then that if I let it continue even one more day without pushing back the right way, I would be the one trying to prove ownership of something that already looked like it belonged to someone else. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with the windows open, letting the cooler air push out the heat of the day, but the smell of dust and asphalt still clung to everything like the road itself had followed me inside, and I spread the papers out one by one, Every document I had saved over the past 6 years, every permit, every survey, every stamped approval that proved what I already knew but now needed to defend. The overhead light hummed softly, and I could hear crickets outside, steady, constant, a rhythm that made it easier to focus as I started going through the stack again, slower this time, not looking for confirmation, but for something specific, something they had overlooked. Because people like Victoria do not operate randomly, they rely on assumptions, on gaps, on the idea that no one will dig deeper than surface-level authority. I pulled out the original survey map, the one with the county seal still crisp in the corner, and laid it flat, tracing the boundary lines with my finger, following the exact path of the road from the main access point all the way to my property line. Every measurement was there, every angle recorded, every marker accounted for. Then I reached for the easement documentation, the one most people never fully read because it is dense, technical, filled with language that feels designed to discourage attention. But I had read it before, multiple times, and now I read it again, slower, line by line, until a single phrase stood out in a way it had not before, not because it was new, but because now it mattered. Non-transferable private access designation, exempt from external association governance. I read it twice, then a third time, letting the words settle, because that was not interpretation, that was direct, specific, and legally binding. I leaned back slightly, the chair creaking under my weight, and for the first time since I saw that sign, something shifted. Not relief, not yet, but clarity. They were not just overstepping. They were ignoring a restriction that was written clearly enough that anyone who actually checked would have seen it. Which meant one of two things. Either they never verified it, or they saw it and assumed it would not matter. I picked up the notice I had folded earlier, the one about penalties, and compared the language, looking for alignment, and that was when I noticed the difference. Their document referenced general community enforcement guidelines, broad, unspecific, the kind of language that works when you are dealing with shared property, but not when you are dealing with something explicitly excluded. It looked official, but it did not connect to anything enforceable on my land. That was the crack, small, easy to miss if you were not paying attention, but enough to pull the whole thing apart if applied correctly. I stood up, walked over to the window, and looked out toward the direction of the road, even though I could not see it from there, just knowing it was still out there, still being used, still operating under a false layer of authority. And in that moment, I understood exactly what had changed. This was no longer about proving ownership to myself. That part was already settled. This was about exposing the difference between what looked official and what actually held up when someone with real authority took a closer look. And for the first time since this started, I knew where to aim. The next morning I did not go straight to the road. I went somewhere quieter first, somewhere that still smelled like paper, ink, and time, because if they were going to lean on what looked official, I was going to bring in what actually was. The county records office opened at 8, fluorescent lights already humming overhead, the air inside cool and still, like nothing in that building had changed in years, and in a way, that was exactly why I was there. I signed in, nodded to the clerk behind the counter, and asked for archived property filings tied to my parcel number, not the digital summaries, but the full record, the kind that takes longer to pull and even longer to read. She disappeared into the back without much reaction, which told me this was routine for her, even if it was not for most people. While I waited, I leaned against the counter, listening to the faint shuffle of papers, the distant sound of a printer working somewhere out of sight, and I thought about how easy it had been for Victoria to stand on my road and speak with confidence. How quickly something starts to feel real when no one challenges it with the right kind of proof. A few minutes later, the clerk returned with a thick folder, edges worn slightly, tabs sticking out at uneven angles, the kind of file that had been handled enough times to matter. I took it to one of the tables near the window, sat down, and opened it carefully, not rushing, because details do not reveal themselves to people who are in a hurry. The first few pages were familiar, copies of documents I already had, permits, surveys, recorded boundaries, but deeper into the stack, I found what I was hoping for, the original filing tied to the access designation, older paper, different formatting, language that did not try to simplify itself for convenience. I traced the lines again, slower this time, confirming the easement classification, the restriction clauses, the exact phrasing that separated my road from anything governed by an association. And then I saw something else, a notation tied to county enforcement, a reference to jurisdictional authority that applied specifically when private access was misrepresented or obstructed by external parties. That word, enforcement, stood out in a different way now, not like the one printed on their sign, but grounded, tied to actual authority instead of assumed control. I copied the reference number down, then cross-checked it with the index at the back of the file, following the trail until I had a complete picture, not just of ownership, but of what happened when someone tried to override it without standing. By the time I closed the folder, the room felt quieter than before, like everything I needed had already been there, waiting for someone willing to look closely enough. I thanked the clerk, stepped back outside into the sunlight, and the heat hit me again, sharper this time, but it did not feel the same as the day before. Because now, I was not looking at a situation I needed to argue. I was looking at something that could be corrected, precisely, with the right person standing in the right place, holding the right information. And for the first time since this started, I was not reacting anymore. I was preparing. By the time I got back to the road that afternoon, the system they had put in place was running smoother than ever, like it had always been there, like it belonged. And that was exactly what made it dangerous, because once something looks permanent, people stop questioning how it started. I parked just off to the side and watched for a while, not stepping in, not interrupting, just observing the flow, the barrier lifting, the keypad beeping softly, residents moving in and out. Without hesitation, their confidence built entirely on something they had never verified themselves. That was when I noticed a familiar truck pulling up, an older model Ford with faded paint and a toolbox rattling slightly in the back, and behind the wheel was Mark Jensen, a surveyor I had worked with a couple of years back when I first marked out the boundaries on this land. He slowed near the entrance, looked at the sign, then at me, and parked off to the side before stepping out, boots hitting the ground with that same deliberate pace I remembered from job sites. "This yours?" he asked, nodding toward the setup, and I could hear the edge in his voice, not confusion, but recognition that something was off. I handed him a copy of the survey map I had brought with me, unfolded just enough to show the boundary lines, and watched as he scanned it, eyes narrowing slightly as he traced the same path I had the night before. "They are outside the line," he said after a moment. Simple, direct, no hesitation, the kind of statement that only comes from someone who deals in exact measurements, not assumptions. I told him about the signs, the barrier, the claim of association control, and he let out a quiet breath, not surprised, just confirming something he had likely seen before in different forms. He walked over to one of the posts, crouched down, brushed away a thin layer of dust with his hand until the top of a survey marker showed through, just a small metal cap embedded in the ground, easy to miss if you did not know where to look. He tapped it lightly with his knuckle, then stood back up and pointed down the line. "Every one of these markers tells the same story," he said, "and none of it matches that sign." That was the kind of validation I needed, not because I doubted what I had found, but because when this moved forward, it was not going to be just my word against theirs. It was going to be backed by someone who understood the land the same way I did, someone who could stand there and say exactly where the line was without leaving room for interpretation. We stood there for a few more minutes, watching another car pass through, the driver barely glancing at the setup, trusting it completely, and Mark shook his head slightly. "People see a sign, they believe it," he said. "Does not matter who put it there." I folded the map back up, slid it under my arm, and looked down the road again. The same road I had built, the same one now running under a system that did not belong there. But this time, it did not feel like something slipping away. It felt like something waiting to be corrected, and now I was not the only one who could see exactly where it had gone wrong. I did not rush the next step, because rushing is what gets people caught arguing instead of proving. And by that evening I had everything laid out across my desk in a way that made the entire situation look different, not complicated, not emotional, just structured, like a job that needed to be done right the first time. The survey map sat on top, clean and clear, with the boundary lines highlighted, the easement documentation right beside it with the clause marked in pen, and the county enforcement reference written out in full, so there was no room for confusion. I added copies of the permits, the original filings, even photos I had taken of the signs, the barrier, the keypad, everything in place exactly as it had been installed, Because if someone was going to step in, they needed to see not just what was written, but what was actually happening on the ground. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that lets you think without interruption, and I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator in the background, steady, consistent, like a reminder to keep everything measured, controlled. I picked up my phone, scrolled through the number I had written down earlier from the county records, and paused for a second, not because I was unsure, but because I understood exactly what this call meant. This was not a complaint. This was not asking for clarification. This was initiating a correction that would bring in someone with the authority to look at the situation and act on it without interpretation getting in the way. When I made the call, I kept it simple, explained that there was a private access road being represented as community controlled, that signage and barriers had been installed without legal standing, and that I had documentation confirming the designation and the restriction against external governance. The person on the other end listened without interrupting, asked for the parcel number, the location, and then one question that told me everything I needed to know. Is the access currently being restricted or misrepresented to the public? I looked out the window again, toward the direction of the road, even though I could not see it, and said yes. There was a brief pause, not hesitation, just processing, and then they told me someone would come out to review the situation. No promises, no timelines, just a clear next step. After the call ended, I gathered the documents into a folder, clipped everything together so it could be handed over without explanation getting lost, and set it by the door. Outside, the light had shifted toward evening, the heat easing off just enough to make the air feel lighter, but the road was still out there, still running under a system that did not belong. The difference now was that it was not just my responsibility to correct it. It was about to be seen by someone who dealt in enforcement, not assumption, someone who would not be influenced by signage or confident explanations. And for the first time since this started, I was not standing alone on that line anymore. I was bringing the line with me. The next morning, I was already standing near the entrance before the sun had fully cleared the tree line. The air cool, but carrying that same faint smell of dust and worn gravel that had become too familiar over the past few days, and everything looked exactly the same at first glance. The sign still planted firm, the barrier arm still rising and lowering with that quiet mechanical rhythm, cars already beginning to pass through like nothing had ever been out of place. But there was a difference in how I stood there now, not watching, not waiting, just ready, because this time I was not here to argue or explain. I was here to present something that did not bend. Around 8:10 a.m., I heard it before I saw it, the low, steady engine of a county vehicle rolling up the main access road, not fast, not slow, just deliberate, like it had done this 100 times before. The truck came into view, marked clearly, and behind the wheel was Sheriff Daniel Brooks, stepping out with the kind of calm presence that does not need to announce itself to be understood. He looked at me first, gave a short nod, then turned his attention to the entrance, taking in the sign, the barrier, the keypad, all of it without saying a word. I handed him the folder, everything organized, every document in place, and he flipped it open right there, scanning through the pages with a practiced eye, not rushing, not reacting, just confirming. The sound of the barrier lifting again cut through the moment as another car approached, the driver slowing slightly when they noticed the marked vehicle. Uncertainty replacing the routine confidence that had been there before. A few residents had started to gather at a distance, drawn by the presence of something official, something they could not immediately interpret. Then Victoria's car pulled up, right on time, like she had been expecting to check on things. But the moment she stepped out and saw the sheriff standing there, something in her posture shifted, not dramatically, just enough to break that constant line of confidence she carried. She walked over, still composed, still controlled, and began explaining the situation, using the same language she had used with me, community access, improved flow, internal approval, but this time the words did not fill the space the same way. The sheriff listened, just like I had, but when he responded, his voice was different, steady, direct, and grounded in something that did not rely on interpretation. He pointed to the documents, referenced the designation, the restriction against external governance, and then, without raising his voice, made it clear that the signage and barrier did not have legal standing on this property. There was a pause, a brief moment where everything seemed to hold still, the hum of the barrier motor, the faint rustle of wind across the gravel, the quiet shift of people realizing something had just changed. Then he stepped toward the sign, reached down, and began removing it, not aggressively, not rushed, just methodical, like he was correcting something that should not have been there in the first place. The metal gave way with a hollow sound as the bolts came loose, and for the first time since this started, that sound did not feel like something being taken, it felt like something being returned. Victoria stood there, silent now, watching as the structure she had put in place came apart piece by piece, and no amount of explanation could hold it together anymore, because this was not about confidence or presentation. This was about what actually held up when someone with the right authority looked at it closely enough, and in that moment, the difference between appearance and reality was no longer something you had to explain. It was something everyone could see. The moment the first sign came free, everything else started to feel lighter, not just physically, but in a way you could hear, like the air itself had been waiting for something to shift back into place, and as Sheriff Brooks set the metal panel aside, he moved on to the next piece without hesitation, stepping toward the barrier control unit with the same steady focus. The keypad beeped once more as someone instinctively tried to use it, then stopped when they realized it no longer mattered, and the quiet that followed was different from before, no longer controlled by a system, but open, unstructured, the way it had always been. The sheriff examined the barrier arm briefly, then turned to Victoria, his tone still calm, still measured, as he explained that any installation placed without proper jurisdiction on private property had to be removed or disabled immediately. There was no argument in his voice, no escalation, just a clear statement of what was already established. Victoria responded, but the confidence in her words had changed, not gone, but thinner, less certain, as she referenced internal approvals and community benefit again, trying to rebuild something that had already started to come apart. He listened, just as he had before, then pointed back to the documentation, reiterating that internal processes do not override recorded property designations, especially when those designations explicitly exclude external governance. The difference this time was not just what was being said, but how it landed, because now everyone standing there had seen the first piece removed, had heard the sound of it, had watched something that looked permanent get undone without resistance. One of the residents stepped closer, looking at the ground where the sign had been, then at the survey marker just visible beneath the surface, and I could see it in their expression, the moment where assumption gives way to realization. The sheriff reached down and disengaged the barrier mechanism, lifting the arm manually and securing it in an open position so it could not restrict access anymore, and the absence of that quiet mechanical hum made the space feel wider, less controlled, like something had been returned to its natural state. A few cars approached slowly, drivers unsure, then continued through without stopping, no codes, no permission, just movement the way it was supposed to be. Victoria stood off to the side now, watching, her clipboard still in hand, but no longer serving the purpose it had a day ago, because there was nothing left for it to support. The sheriff finished his review, handed the folder back to me, and gave a short nod, the kind that did not need explanation, because everything that needed to happen had already happened in front of everyone there. As he walked back to his vehicle, the small crowd began to disperse, conversations starting quietly, different from before, less certain, more reflective, like people were recalibrating what they thought they understood. I stayed where I was for a moment longer, looking down the road again, the same stretch of ground I had built, now free of anything that did not belong, and the silence that settled over it was not empty. It was complete, the kind of quiet that only comes when something has been put back exactly where it was supposed to be all along. By late afternoon, the road had settled back into something familiar, not because anything new had been added, but because everything that did not belong had been taken away, and that difference was enough to change how it felt under your feet and how it sounded when tires rolled across it. The air was quieter now, not empty, just honest again, without the artificial rhythm of a barrier lifting and dropping or the sharp tone of a keypad deciding who could pass. I walked the length of it slowly, the same way I had the day before, but this time every step felt like it landed where it was supposed to. No second guessing, no background tension, just the solid, steady ground I had built from the start. The survey markers were still there, exactly where they had always been, small and easy to miss unless you knew what to look for, but now they meant something more than just measurements. They were proof that lines do not disappear just because someone decides to ignore them. A couple of residents drove by during that time, slower than before, more aware, some giving a small nod, others just passing through quietly, and I could see the shift in how they looked at the road, not as something shared by default, but as something that had a boundary they had not considered before. Victoria did not come back that day, and in a way, that said more than anything she could have explained, because the system she had relied on no longer held, and without it, there was nothing left to stand on but the same reality she had tried to move around. I stopped near the entrance, where the sign had been, and looked down at the ground where the bolts had left small impressions in the surface, marks that would fade over time, but for now, they told the story clearly enough. I reached down, brushed a bit of loose gravel aside, and exposed the edge of the survey marker again, the same one Mark had pointed out, the same one that had been there long before any sign was put up, and I let my hand rest there for a second, feeling the cool metal under my fingers. That was the difference. Not who spoke the loudest, not who looked the most official, but what was actually recorded, measured, and backed by something real. As the sun started to drop lower, casting longer shadows across the road, I turned and walked back toward the house, the sound of my boots steady, unbroken, just like it had been the day I finished building this place. Some people think control comes from putting up signs, from telling others where they can and cannot go, but what I learned from all of this is simpler than that. Control, real control, comes from knowing exactly where the line is and having the patience to let the right moment prove it for you. Because in the end, they did not lose because I argued better or spoke louder. They lost because the truth was already written down, waiting for someone who understood it well enough to bring it into the light.